Welcome, Hillary. This is Hillary Shute, who's an expert on graphic novels and graphic narratives of a variety of kinds at the University of Chicago in the English department. Hillary, I was hoping that today we could talk about something that you've worked on a lot, which is the development of comics as a register in which expressions of concern and of witnessing have expressed themselves, especially with regard to nuclear matters, and even more particularly with the remarkable figure Keiji Nakazawa, who has really done so much to transform the Japanese understanding of what happened at Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Sure. So Keiji Nakazawa's work, Barefoot Gen, is one of the most famous manga in Japanese history. It sold over 8 million copies. This work is a sort of cultural truth in Japan. And I'm interested in Nakazawa because he was the first person to do so-called atomic bomb manga. So this is a genre that he created. Even saying the genre of atomic bomb manga is to me an interesting and rich idea. So Keiji Nakazawa himself is a survivor of Hiroshima. So he was 6 years old when the atomic bomb dropped, and he was on his way to school less than a mile from where the bomb hit. And he was standing next to a cement wall with a line of other children, and he was basically himself unscathed when the bomb hit, except for superficial injuries. So Keiji Nakazawa didn't decide to become a cartoonist until the 60s, and at that point he moved from Hiroshima to Tokyo. And he kept trying to get at this story from a fictional point of view. Culturally, it was very unusual for hibakusha, survivors of the atomic bomb, to speak out about their experiences.
There was quite a taboo, in fact, a kind of shunning of the hibukasha, right?
There was absolutely a shunning. So officially, there was U.S. Imposed censorship on discussion about the atomic bomb, but this was also taken on by the Japanese themselves. So there was a cultural and official U.S. and Japanese censorship, and once the official U.S. censorship ended, culturally, the community enforced it. Hibakusha were shunned, they were stigmatized, people didn't want their kids to play with kids who were survivors. There was an incredible stigma. And we see this in the fascinating way that he started to try to do this work. So even when he did stories about survivors in a fictional context, these stories were considered so politically radical that they were shunted off from the mainstream. So his first attempt at this was a story called Pelted by Black Rain, a very evocative title. He did a story called Suddenly One Day, also about the bomb, fictional. And this story elicited an enormous, enormous response. He got hundreds and hundreds of letters from people telling him how much the story had meant to them and how they didn't even understand, just simply factually, some of the parameters of what had happened that day that were outlined in this story. So at that point, he decided to make a go doing an autobiographical story about being a survivor. And that resulted in Ore wa Mita. In the US, it's called I Saw It, which came out as a standalone comic book in 1972. And so this was the first autobiographical comics work about the atomic bomb. And it was also the first significant cultural work by a survivor that dared to take on the physical suffering and dared to take on the emperor system and be critical of the Japanese in addition to being critical of the Americans. So it was a major work and a taboo-shattering work on many different fronts.
The story is unbelievably affecting when one reads it even now, half a century later. I mean, just his mother saw the father and the brother pinned under the house, and eventually fire overcame them and she had to leave and they burned to death.
I mean, it's devastating. I'm getting goosebumps just thinking about it. So his mother, Kaimi Nakazawa, was actually pulled away from the house before the house collapsed in flames by a neighbor who physically dragged her away as she was trying to save her husband and her son and her daughter from the wreckage of this house. It's a devastating story. And she actually died in 1966 from leukemia, you know, the leukemia that was so common to survivors of the atomic bomb. And it was her death that spurred Keiji Nakazawa to do stories about the bomb. And one of the details that I've always found very moving is the fact that he was so upset by the fact that there were no bones left over when she was cremated, as there typically are, that made him decide that he would do comics about the atomic bomb.
As a way of preserving something from that.
As a way of preserving something, because he was so devastated and so enraged that the bomb had even deprived him of his mother's bones, that even her bones were so weak that they all became ashes when she was cremated, that there was nothing solid, not even a tiny piece of bone that he had left of his mother.
For generations after the bomb, most Americans' perception or understanding of what had happened from the point of view of the Japanese came through John Hersey's book, Hiroshima, where he followed 6 people and what happened to them. But there's something, seems to me, of a sea change that happens when the voice isn't transmitted through a Western American writer, and Nakazawa's own witnessing becomes the primary form of expression. There's also a change of medium from a book to something that's graphically presented. Could you sketch what this object is? I want to dig in and really look at the way the page is laid out, the way the graphics work.
This story has a frame narrative where Keiji Nakazawa is an adult explaining to readers how he came to be a cartoonist doing this kind of work. And so we see him in the beginning in Tokyo, rueing that his mother was never able to ever visit Tokyo, which is something she had always wanted to do. So he makes it a sort of a Bildungsroman in a way. Here I am as an adult, and now I'm going to go back and show you what I was like as a child and how I got to be, you know, the artist I am today. First, we get this, I think, really key scene in which he says, "I am Keiji Nakazawa, born in Hiroshima City, March 1939, third son out of 5 kids." So what's key here is that he is establishing that this is a first-person narrative, and he's taking responsibility for it as a work of autobiography. This was the unprecedented part, right? To have this kind of history and to have it be framed as autobiography. And what's also key here is that he is establishing his identity as a son, which is something we also see in famous works like Art Spiegelman's Mouse that came out in its short version around the same time as I saw it. And then the page goes back to 1941 and an air raid. And here we see his mother's feet tramping, and I love that we get the sound effect here that says tramp, up the stairs in an echo of his feet here. So then we're back in the past, from the 60s to the 40s, and we have these, I think, very moving scenes of everyday family life. So here's a scene of the family having dinner. We learn that there isn't a lot of food in the household. Here we have a scene of Keiji visiting his father as his father is working and asking him to please teach him how to draw a soldier. We get a sense of the kind of rhythms of their everyday life. He says here, "My happiest times were catching grasshoppers," right? So we get a sense of the slowness of their life in addition to the big events that they were dealing with, like the war. So then the book takes us to 8:15 a.m. And what we get here is a panel that is actually representing the explosion.
This is August 7th, 1945.
Right. Many of the survivors described their experience of the bomb as a noiseless flash. People's faces are starting to be framed in only black and white. We have a sort of expressionistic view of a purple tree flying through the air, broken apart, and then the panel goes all black. There hadn't been imagery like this in any other drawn work. These images of people with their skin dripping off of their bodies, this is the sort of signature of this work. This very hard to look at, grotesque, almost cartoonishly grotesque set of images of people with their skin burned off and people with their skin dripping and hanging from their bodies. What we get here is a kind of conflation of a popular idiom with non-genre work about witnessing. So when he says here, everybody's turned into monsters, these people look like you might expect monsters to look like in a science fiction manga series.
It's also transmitted through the vocabulary of a child. I mean,
Right.
a monster was
Right.
something that children are afraid of.
The book is inhabiting the kind of discursive position of the child, which is very powerful and very moving. And that he drew it so bluntly, one might say, in the conventional popular idiom of manga, but depicting these grotesque and horrifying realities, made people wonder about just how upsetting these images were. You know, it's like it's science fiction, but it's not science fiction, it's reality. The kind of gap that's implied here between a conventional, popular, violent science fiction story and the fact that this is being framed as what he saw with his own eyes was part of what made this work such an unusual and such an upsetting work. One way that I've liked to try to understand this is that he created himself a new kind of visual idiom that, to me, is about defamiliarizing received images of the war. These are images that are grotesque, they're on the ground, they're inhabiting the kind of exaggeration that would seem to be a flourish, except in this case, he's claiming it as, I saw this. In a way, people talk often of trauma as frame breaking, that it produces experiences that can't be contained, and trying to express those experiences is so often form shattering and genre shattering for that very reason, because trauma is, by definition, a kind of excessive experience. It's an experience that has to be deferred, can't be understood, in the instant. Trauma in this instance is helping to create these new forms. That this is a form that's working in this sort of grotesque, exaggerated idiom, but it's also a form that's documenting with that vocabulary and expanding that vocabulary. This is never something that can be contained. And I think with the comics frames, we constantly get a sense of the tension between what can be contained within the frame and what is outside of the frame and can't be contained within the frame, both in terms of historical realities and in terms of the burden of expressing those realities. So comics is this constant counterpoint between presence and absence. So it's always making you aware of what can be pictured and what can't be pictured, what can be put in the frame and what makes the frame possible but can't exist within the frame.
And what can be done in words and what can be done wordlessly through images, and then what their combination does.
Right, so in comics, the words and the images don't match up the way people often think they do. People often think that comics is an illustrative form in which there's a narrative track and then the pictures match the narrative. Actually, comics is a form that's all about disjunct. So the words are doing one thing often, and the pictures are doing another thing. We also have the disjunct between what we see in the frame and what we don't see in the gutter. So there's a constant kind of rhythm in comics between what you know and what you can't know. And so that's one of the reasons that it's such a powerful form for trying to express traumatic histories.
Thank you enormously, Hillary, for this really interesting discussion. And I should say that your book, Graphic Women, is a terrific entry point into thinking about questions of trauma and the graphic novel.
Thank you. It's been so interesting to think about comics in this context today.